Tuesday morning, FH&P Law Talk, as we welcome to our studios a variety of lawyers that come from that fine organization. If you ever find yourself in need of lawyers, you want to talk to FH&P, whether it's Jim Herpiger, who is sort of redefining his role within the company, but you find them over at 275 Lawrence Avenue, top floor, one of those beautiful new buildings built by Shane Warman that are so picturesque and such beautiful buildings. Colin Flannigan, welcome to our studios. Nice to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Phil.
Okay. So here's the deal. As I understand this, with the very brief notes that you sent me, that as of November the 28th of this year, a new Societies Act is going to come into force. And by 2018, 2 years later, it's going to become law. Who is impacted by this piece of legislation?
Well, there's going to be two things. First, let's talk about who's going to be impacted, and then let's talk about date, because time and date are going to be important for this. So who's going to be effective? Anyone that sits on a board, anyone that's involved with a society, whether it's a charitable society, whether it's not a charitable society.
Nonprofit associate. Now, is there a difference? Is it semantics, or is there a difference between nonprofit associations and societies? Or am I putting you on the spot here?
Well, that's a good question. A lot of associations are actually societies as well, too. So it's important to look, if you are on a board, whether or not the association you're part of is actually a society.
Okay.
So there's also some federally incorporated not-for-profit incorporations as well, too, and those are a different kettle of fish. Those are under federal legislation.
Right.
Today what we're talking about is BC society.
We're talking the Boys and Girls Clubs. We're talking Caris Outdoor Society, talking the Triathlon organization. Those are the kinds of organizations we're talking about?
Yes, I sit on a board as well, too, that calls itself an association, but it's a society as well, too, and this affects us as well. Okay.
So this is good legislation, or this is just yet another layer of government bureaucracy stepping in to justify another whole host of people sitting at computer desks and processing paper?
Well, I can understand the question, but the old Society Act, the current one that's in place, it's an older piece of legislation, in all honesty. And as our society grows and changes, the law has to change and grow with our society.
Right.
And this is what we see with legislation. When it becomes starting to move towards being outdated, then the legislature steps in and starts to create some new legislation that can perhaps address some of these changes.
Is it the legislation that's outdated, or is it the way that we handle it? Because everything, of course, is moving to digital. Everything is moving to computers and data terminals and so on and so forth, and stuff whistling back and forth through server farms. Is that the change? Because we just don't ship you manila envelopes to Victoria anymore?
Well, that is exactly one of the changes as well, too. And that's always been perhaps a bit of a frustration from a legal standpoint when dealing with societies is some of the delays with registration. Under the current Society Act, all filings have to be paper with the Registrar of Companies.
Right.
Moving forward, we're going to be looking at, as part of the transitioning, and we'll get into that term shortly, is moving towards electronic filing. This is going to do a number of things. It's going to move things quicker. It's going to avoid the need of rush charges that apply, and it's also going to make a lot of filings cheaper as well, too. So there's a lot of benefits involved for societies as well.
Now, and I see that there's a number here that you had just scribbled and shoved under my nose, and the note that you put under my nose says, Phil, there are approximately 27,000 existing societies in the province of BC. So as I look at that number and my eyes get really big, are all of these 27,000 societies already aware of what's coming at them, or have they been aware that the government is planning to make these changes, or is this kind of landing at their next board meeting where the chairman of the board or the head of the society is going to say, folks, settle back, get yourself a coffee because I got some splaining to do?
Perhaps a bit of both, in all honesty.
Right.
I mean, this is a change in legislation that there's been discussions about it going on for the last 2 to 3 years.
Right.
So it's not something new in that sense that people knew it was coming, the details of which are starting to come out, and some of the actual mechanics on the way things are going, we're starting to get a better idea now. Now, as far as this transitioning term I mentioned, and that's going to be the filing electronic of both the Constitution and the bylaws of the society, we're still learning some of these details from the Registrar of Companies, and we're expecting to learn more in August of this year.
Right.
So It's an ongoing process as far as getting information out to the societies and then out from the societies to their members.
So if you'll allow me, August of this year, you're going to know more of the details. The first real hard and fast thump of a brick on a table is going to be November of 2016, and then they have 2 years to come into compliance.
Well, the important thing to know for societies is this. So for everyone that's sitting on a board of directors, everyone that's a member of a society, is that the new Societies Act comes into effect November of this year, November 28th, 2016.
Right.
And the vast majority of the provisions in the Act are in full force and effect when it comes into effect.
Right.
Exactly. Now, there's some leeway provisions that there is some grace period, but generally speaking, the Act as a whole comes into force and effect. And that's that 2-year delay. And these are going to be some particular types of provisions. Now, they mostly deal with appointment of directors, so not to invalidate any of these current appointments, because let's be honest, a number of societies, they're not going to be able to make all their changes before that comes into place, and they're going to have some time to be able to do it. Things about transitioning over to this electronic filing, as well as some of these requirements with directors as well, too. So the important thing for societies now is to be aware of these changes that they're coming, and start looking at your documents, start looking at your constitution, start looking at your bylaws, and it's worth having a review of these.
I was just going to say what I'm really hearing is that there's a lot of legal firms, and I say this warmly and gently to yourself, but there's a lot of legal firms that are going to find themselves dealing with those 28,000 societies, and there's a lot of accounting firms that are going to be doing exactly the same thing. Not that this is salad days or bread and butter money, but there's definitely going to be an interesting addition to the cash flow over the next 2 years for both legal firms and accounting firms.
And for timing-wise, an important one to address is going to be registered charities, because there's also going to have to be some dealings with the Canada Revenue Agency, the Charities Directorate. So it's going to be important to get on top of this sooner rather than later.
Is BC moving itself to the head of the charge? We're the first province in the country, or as happens often, are we getting caught up to a number of other jurisdictions across the nation?
Hard for me to comment on that one, but perhaps more the latter.
Right. We've been behind the curve. There's been other priorities.
I wouldn't say that. I would say more that other provinces have made some changes already to their society-type legislation, and BC's making its change now.
Okay. If you are on a board of directors of a society or an association, if you have any questions, I have a sense that Mr. Flannigan has spent significant amounts of time studying the changes that are coming to the Societies Act. So if you want to pretend that you're at a house party, and if you want to pretend you're in the kitchen, and if you want to pretend that you've just discovered that Colin Flannigan is a lawyer who's got his head wrapped around the legal side of these changes, now's your opportunity to say, hey, listen, could I just talk to you for a second? Best free legal advice you're ever going to get, 250-862-2525. It is a significant subject, changes to the Societies Act. They're going to come in place effective November the 28th. They are going to land on the desks of most societies, 28,000 of them in British Columbia in August. Colin Flannigan from FH&P is in our studios. Colin, I think this is where I now have to say, clearly this is a big piece of legislation, but there must be some A's and some B's and some C's. Maybe we just start with the A's, and if you could talk a little bit about some of the prime directives, some of the prime changes that are going to be coming.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And we won't have time to be able to go through the entire piece of legislation.
Not even going to try.
So what I really want to do is just draw people's attention to some particular key facts. So the A's, as you put them.
Yep.
So one of the first things is we've already mentioned the term transitioning. What this means is electronic filing. So currently I said that all societies do the paper filing. It's going to be moving over to the electronic filing. Now, this has to be done within the next 2 years.
And you cannot not do this.
If you don't do it,
yeah.
and not do it, do the triple negative or double negative on
yeah.
that. If you don't do the transitioning into electronic filing, you run the risk of getting struck. So within 2 years, if you don't do your annual report filing, you run the risk of being struck.
Which means you no longer exist.
Exactly.
Right.
So
struck from the records.
Precisely. So there's going to be obvious concerns of that happening. So every society is going to have to transition. going to have to move into this electronic filing. And what it is going to be filing the Constitution and the bylaws.
Right.
Now, the constitutions themselves, there's going to be restrictions on what can be put into them. And it's only going to be the name and the purposes, and if a society is a member-funded society. I'll get to member-funded societies probably last, because that's kind of a newer topic. Things that current societies have in their bylaws and the Constitution might be things like unalterable provisions. These are often present in societies, particularly charitable societies.
Unalterable provisions.
An example is going to be a charitable society that says, upon dissolution, this provision is unalterable. All of our assets have to go to another registered charity. That sort of provision. Those can no longer be in the Constitution. Those have to get moved into the bylaws as part of the transitioning provision. And they can no longer be stated as unalterable. Now, they can be changed by unanimous resolution if you want to state that in your new bylaws. Or it's one of those areas that it's going to have to get moved as part of that transition.
Is this good law? With what you know about Society Act, how societies operate, you've indicated you're already sitting on the board of one. So is this something that really had to happen?
I think that for a number of societies, it's going to make life easier going forward.
Okay, once it's done.
But it's going to require action now. And I think that's one thing that people have to realize is, yes, you can try to continue on with your existing bylaws, and there's changes to the Act about as far as what's permissible and not permissible in the bylaws. And if you have a provision in your current bylaws that is inconsistent with the new Societies Act, that provision just has no force and effect. So you run the risk of having certain types of provisions that are no longer in effect.
Got it.
You also won't be taking advantage of some of these new provisions in the Act as well, too. So it requires action in the sense that, at the very least, a reviewing of the bylaws, reviewing of your Constitution, reviewing on how you're actually going to do the transition process. And it's also going to reviewing your board of directors as well, too, is a perfect example. Because if directors are currently being remunerated, you can only have a certain percentage. It's got to be less than half that are, quote-unquote, affiliated with the society, meaning that they are employed by them. So that's going to be another.
So remunerated, or stipend. I mean, there's an honorarium. There's a stipend, which is definitely not remuneration, because remuneration to me indicates salary, benefits, significant amounts of money, where honorariums and stipends are not.
Well, it's a good question and good point, and I think there's still going to be some clarification to come with the new Act as far as where lines are going to be drawn with certain things, and particularly dealing with, say, reimbursement of expenses as well, too.
Okay.
And this is something that we're going to learn more about with the new legislation as we get closer towards implementation, and these are certainly ideas and topics for people to start thinking about.
All right.
So some other topics to consider.
Some more on the A list.
Some more on the A list. So I already mentioned about the transitioning. Mentioned about the Constitution and the bylaws, the effect on the existing bylaws. I previously mentioned about provisions of no longer having force and effect. So a society might say, okay, well, look, we don't have a large budget. We can't afford to hire a lawyer to change our bylaws, do the review. What's going to happen if we don't? Well, at the very least, you got to do your transitioning.
Yeah.
Then you run the risk of having some of those being no force and effect, some of your provisions. Another option.
I need to jump in here.
Yeah.
Is this onerous, and is this the kind of thing that is going to, by virtue of the expense entailed, effectively almost deep six some societies, that it's just not going to be possible for them to pay for what they're being asked to do?
It could cause some difficulties for some societies. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat that, but there's also going to be some time as well, too.
Okay.
We do have the 2-year window to do the transition, so it's not like a society.
It's got to be done in 6 months, and so it has the big legal bill. It can be phased in over time.
Exactly. So there is some benefit there, but it's one of those things that has to be put on the mind for these societies that this is something that's going to need to be addressed.
Yeah.
So other options as far as looking at the constating documents, that Constitution and the bylaws, there is new model bylaws as part of what's going to be the regulations for the new Societies Act. It's still considered an orders in council right now. It's available on the BC
government
website. Exactly. There is model bylaws on there as well, too, that does have some of these changes. So at the very least, some societies can start taking a look and see, okay, well, what are some of these changes? Do we need any of these changes? Can we take advantage of them? But there's going to be some things, though, that perhaps should be taken advantage of or at least be addressed.
So the information is easily available on the government website once you find it. Download it, and it gives you the option and it gives you the ability to see templates so that you can parallel and see where you fit and where you don't.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Listen, I need to take one more quick break here this morning, and then we will continue for another short while our conversation with Colin Flannigan from FH&P, talking about the big changes that are coming with the New Societies Act that comes into force November the 28th of this year, and all of the changes and all of the adjustments and all of the new rules and provisos need to be in place as of November the 28th of 2018 for existing societies. We're going to take a quick break. If you've been having any questions or any thoughts in your mind, love to hear from you at 250-862-2525. It's a little on the dry side, but it's sort of like talking about Revenue Canada and taxes, which is suddenly in the back of my mind. Because we are now getting ready to swing into tax time. I absolutely hate those people. We're going to be back in a moment. Definitely a pleasure to have in our service or in our studios Colin Flannigan from FH&P. Colin, clearly for you, this is a comfort zone. You know, were you the guy who was the designatee who was said, Colin, we want you to take a look at this, or how did you inherit this rather complex file?
Well, I think you're being a little generous to me by saying in my comfort zone. I do appreciate that. I do act for a number of societies, and I do sit on the board for a society as well,
right,
too, as do many people. So this is an area that I do practice in, and this is certainly an area that I'm happy to discuss with other societies as well, too, if they do have any questions about this.
Okay. So we were sort of dealing with the whole concept of A's, B's, C's, and D's. It is a massive undertaking, and clearly we're not going to be able to get even through all the A's or the priority one, whatever you want to call it. But is there anything before we say goodbye, and I thank you for your time here this morning, is there anything that we definitely want to hit on just so that people understand the gravity of the situation? Yes, you have 2 years, but you know what? That 2 years is going to disappear in a hurry.
Yeah, there's a couple more points I really want to address before we leave today.
Absolutely.
And these are going to be as far as requirements on the society. One of them is going to be disclosure requirements. So there's going to be new financial disclosure requirements on societies, particularly regarding reimbursement and expenses of directors. So people that make over a certain threshold, these need to be disclosed as part of the financial disclosure statements that have to be filed with the annual reports.
Now, did not have to be before under the paper system, but now under the electronic is going to need to be?
Yeah, this is going to be a new one, and it's also one that's still getting some clarity as far as when you've got more, for larger societies, they've got a number of higher paid individuals on them. As far as whether or not that needs to be broken down by individual, if it's over the threshold, or whether if it's the cumulative amount that you just state the cumulative amount, that's still being worked out as well too. Senior managers. This is another new topic. A lot of societies currently have a position that I've regularly referred to as an executive director. There's a new definition under the New Societies Act called senior managers, and this is something that for societies that have executive directors, pay attention to this. This is something that you'll want to look at.
Say this again.
Senior managers for societies that have current executive directors.
Which is, there's a lot of them.
Exactly. Look into this. This is going to be an important section of the new act that is going to likely impact your society as well as your executive director. So,
and so is the executive director being reimagined, repositioned, reimaged, re-responsibilied, or is it just strictly title?
This is both new terminology as well as requirements.
Okay.
So we've got a person that's appointed by the board, although not necessarily under the title senior manager, you could catch many executive directors under this category. The exercise a director's authority to manage the activities or internal affairs of the society. So this is really what a lot of executive directors do. They do the hands-on day-to-day management. Now there's going to be exposure to potential liability for these people. So as far as insurance policies, this is something that's going to need to be addressed. And there's also going to be requirements as far as for qualifications.
Yeah. You know what? And I have to say that I think this is overdue. I, too, at one time sat on a number of boards. And we were shocked to discover that we really had no protection. That we, as the directors of the organization, sitting on the board as directors, suddenly we discovered we were liable. We didn't have the protection, and the organization didn't have insurance policies in place. That rose the heart rate by just a little bit and caused people's eyebrows to climb into their forehead as their eyes got bigger with an, oh, my God, I didn't realize. And some people found it quite scary.
I've seen that expression before.
Yeah. Deer in the headlights, we call that. So this is a big deal.
Yeah. One last one that I want to draw people's attention to, and this is member-funded societies. I mentioned this briefly at the start of this show. This is a new category, and for a number of current societies that are more private-based societies where the members have the ones that provide the funds into it, this provides...
Would this be like a family trust that does good works?
Well, family trusts are separate. That's a trust itself.
All right.
So I'm thinking more as an example might be a sports team. Right?
Okay.
So sports team that's incorporated as a society, you've got different requirements that are for member-funded societies that tend to be a little more relaxed and a little more private-based as far as, say, like the financial disclosure. Don't have that with the same member-funded societies. When you dissolve, you can have the assets go back out to the members. You can incorporate into a company. Non-member-funded societies, you can only go for dissolution. Assets have to go to qualified donees. So those are pretty much going to be either societies, charities, that sort of thing. So there's going to be new changes as far as dissolution is concerned.
Perfect example of that would be Crossroads, Drug and Alcohol Counseling Society. And for years we operated buildings as we basically closed the doors on Crossroads, liquidated assets, paid all the bills. We had a significant amount of money left over. And so we parceled that money out. We put money into the Kelowna Foundation so that there was an annual bequeath. We also handed money off to other organizations that were doing similar work as Crossroads, and we felt that they could deserve a $20,000 cash gift from the closure of Crossroads. So I hear where you're going. But you do have to do something with that money. You just can't, or the assets, you just can't let it sit.
Yeah, and what this does is it creates different designations for different types of societies. Not every society is the same. There's some that are designed for those charitable purposes to provide these services, these community-based services, and obtain community funding for it. There's other societies that want to be more privately based. And so this creates that category, this ability to have that separation, that difference.
Right. As you look at this, and we kind of put the bow on this conversation, but as you look at this, are you glad this has happened? Was it time that this happened? And 2 years hence, when all the pain, the toil, the trouble and strife is done, are most organizations going to be glad and say, well, I'm glad we got that done?
I think with any change in law, the actual mechanics of making and accommodating those changes are going to be difficult. I don't think that's going to be much of a surprise for anyone dealing with this.
Because what it really involves is a bunch of work.
It does require some work, yes, as far as both from the societies themselves as well as professionals as well, too.
That advise them.
Exactly.
The lawyers and the accountants and specialists.
Yeah, so there's no doubt there's going to be challenges as an immediate result.
Right.
But long-term, moving forward, operating for these societies, I think things will become a little bit easier.
All right. Listen, this is one that we could probably come back and spend a little more work on in a couple of weeks, or maybe in August for sure, when all that clarity is provided with whatever documentation is going to come from Victoria. That then we absolutely make sure. I'd like you to come back before that, but working towards some sort of an August date. That I think absolutely for sure.
Well, I'd certainly love to come back and talk about this topic. As I mentioned, this is an area I practice in, and this is something that everyone's going to need to, at least by everyone I mean all the societies, need to start addressing. And as we get some more clarification on it, as we start working through this process, I'd love to be able to come back and give some more guidance on it.
You got it. Colin Flannigan can be found at FH&P Lawyers. They are, of course, over on Lawrence Avenue, 400-275 Lawrence. His direct line is 869-6024. 869-6024. Easy number to remember. And if you're having trouble with the phone, just go online to FH&P Lawyers and go to the legal masthead, and you will find Colin Flannigan there. Listen, I really appreciate you being here this morning, taking what is really a dry topic and giving it some life. And here's something I will say. If you are an executive director of an organization, things are going to change quite significantly for you. And I think you or your board should be talking with Mr. Flannigan about those changes and what they look like. Colin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Talk to you.